Australians became acquainted with the Beaufighter very early on in the war, flying in the UK, Malta and North Africa in rAAF squadrons and rAAF squadrons, such as 455 and 456 squadrons. 456 Squadron night fighters were formed in June 1941 by Wing Commander Olive, an Australian pilot who had shot down 6 enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain, while 455 Squadron, who flew with English Coastal Command, were accredited with one of the last operational sorties of the war in Europe. One of those young Australians flying with 89 Squadron rAAF was Mervyn Shippard, a country lad from the Snowy Mountains region of New South Wales. You had 2 tours, UK, Malta, North Africa included. 13 confirmed enemy aircraft shot down. You knew a little bit about the Beaufighter.
After 2 years and approximately 1,000 hours, of which I'd say 500 to 600 would have been at night, 13 confirmed enemy aircraft, I think I did know a little bit about a bow towards the end of my career. I originally flew the Bow 1, that was my first aircraft in which I had a victim, which only had the 420 mils, no machine guns. And that interception I used 67 shells to blow the aeroplane out of the sky. I went on to fly later models, including the final one in May 1943, which was a Bow 6, I think, or something. Very big engines, a dihedral tail. Magnificent aeroplane. I also flew a Bow 2, which was fitted with Merlins. I don't think it was ever used operationally. It was a training aircraft. A nice aeroplane, but nothing compared to the Herc bows.
What about the firepower, Mervyn?
The old Bow, I think, was the most magnificent aeroplane designed for the job in which I asked it to do, a night fighter. I had 10 guns, 420 mil 6303s. I had perfect vision out the front, no nose to get in the road. I also had 2 very powerful engines, and I could stay in the air if necessary for 5 or 6 hours. The firepower, I think, was the most important part of the night fighter. You only had one go at night time, because if you missed the first time, that was it. On top of that, the Bow was fitted out to carry a crew of 2, including Dougie Oxby, who was my radar operator. He was a little Welshman. He finished up at the end of the war as the most highly decorated night fighter radar operator of the whole of the Allies. 23 confirmed, a DSO, DFC, DFM and bar. The durability of the old Bow amazed me. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the durability of it. I remember one night I'd been up for about 3/4 of an hour. I'd had both engines at full bore. At the end of the episode, I was called back because I was getting over enemy territory. As I returned to base, the ground station called me up and said, "We've got another victim for you." I said, "No way, I'm on one engine." Oxby had his radar on and he said, "Shippy, there's one coming straight for us about 3,000 feet below us." I said, "Okay, tell me when to go." He yelled out, "Now," and I rolled the Bow on its back, dived. I knew I was travelling far too fast. I put the wheels and flaps down. As I levelled off, I was within about 300 feet of the enemy aircraft, going like a bat out of hell. I opened fire. I suppose I wouldn't have been more than 100 feet behind the thing. It blew to pieces. It sounded as though I was going through a hailstorm. I had the wheels down. I looked out, and underneath the wheels, in the wheel wells, there was nothing but flame. Oxo yelled out to me, "We're on fire." I'm going to jump. I said, hang on. I said, "Stay put, the thing is still flyable." And within a few moments, it all blew off. I think it must have been the other aeroplane's petrol. Anyhow, we got back on one engine, landed. We'd lost most of the fabric off the elevators, the rudder. The leading edge looked as though somebody had got to it with a sledgehammer. But the old girl stayed together and got us home, safe as pie. Another episode I had in relation to this It was in the middle of an air raid, and I have a feeling the starboard wheel was punctured with shrapnel on the runway. Anyhow, when I came back into land, as I touched down, the old girl just swung violently to the left. We hit the runway. I must have been doing, I suppose, 70 or 80 miles an hour. We hit the runway sideways. The port wing fell off. The starboard wing fell off. The tail fell off. And Dougie and I was strapped inside the thing rolling down the runway, just the body of the bow. And the only damage that was done was I broke the left-hand glass in my goggles when I hit my head against the side of the cockpit. Within half an hour we were back in the air again, another one. Now if it hadn't been for this aeroplane here behind me, I wouldn't be here today, that's for sure. I once flew one in the desert. It was a prototype sort of thing. They had 2 Beaufort guns in it, supposedly to be a tank buster. When I fired that thing, it felt as though I was going backwards. The recoil from those guns, the poor old aeroplane shook to pieces. It felt as though I was going to shake to pieces, but I didn't. I don't think it was ever used on operations, but it was a bit exciting just to fire the thing.
In regards to the handling of the aircraft, Mervyn, what did you think of that?
Once you got the bow in the air, it was a beautiful aeroplane, but unless you were a little bit careful on takeoff, it would turn around and bite you. It had a tendency to swing because of the torque from these monstrous engines. If you weren't careful, you'd develop a swing on takeoff and you couldn't stop it. Once you got it in the air, it was a magnificent thing. My aviation career finished in 1973. I had flown dozens and dozens of different types of aircraft, including the old DC-2, DC-3, DC-4, DC-5, then the Super Connie with Qantas, and the 707. With about 23,000 hours at the end of my flying career, I still consider the 1,000 that I did in this old girl is the most memorable part of my life.
With the majority of Australian pilots flying in the European theatre, this proved to be a double-edged sword. On the negative side, Australia was devoid of aircraft and pilots, while on the positive side, some of these pilots were serving with distinction and gaining valuable combat experience that would soon be put into action in the defence of their homeland. Australia was confronted with the situation of a possible Japanese invasion. They were bombing our cities and had sunk 40 ships off our coast. With the blitzkrieg entry of the Japanese into the war and their territorial push to the south, for the first time in our history, the Australian continent was under attack. One man who would play a major role in the strategic planning and counterattack to the Japanese invasion was Bill Goering. Bill Goering had already won the DFC, flying Sunderlands in 10 Squadron, English Coastal Command.
At about 9 o'clock in the morning, we suddenly saw 2 Junkers 88s approaching the ship, the intention to sink it. We immediately went straight for it, and although we didn't know the words in those days, the Sunderland was turned into a gunship. It had so many guns firing upwards, eventually 16 machine guns firing upwards. And the Lord Haw, who was the traitor in Berlin, he said, "Berlin calling, Germany calling," and then he went on to describe an action where the Sunderland had shot down some of the Ju-88s, and he said, "We call it the Fliegende Stückelschwein, the flying porcupine," and that name stuck. And we had 7, all of us, the top Sunderland pilots that went to England to bring them back, we all had over 7 years working with the Royal Australian Navy, and we knew the Navy, how they operated and so forth. And so when we went to England, we took over the Sunderland flying boats as though they were just another ordinary aeroplane. In fact, Hoot Gibson and I went up with a Royal Air Force squadron leader, and we went solo after 58 minutes instruction on a Sunderland. Never been heard of.
That obviously helped too with the arrival back in Australia. You were facing a new enemy.
Well, when Charles Pearce and myself came back to Australia in 1941, we were both sent to the north. Charles Pearce to command the Catalina wing of 11 and 20 squadrons, and myself to construct the first war room in Australia. From there, for the first time, we could control the ships and aeroplanes and so forth in an orderly manner. I flew all over the Southwest Pacific and got to know all of the bases. I got to know the coast watchers, who were so marvelous, really, our great intelligence arm, because without them we would have lost a lot more aeroplanes and pilots. And then I went to Pearl Harbor about 3 or 4 weeks before it was hit by the Japanese. The Japanese it was a tremendous force of aeroplanes, of the most highly skilled Japanese pilots, and they were looking for the American Pacific Fleet, particularly the carriers, and they weren't there. Admiral Halsey was some 60 miles south of his carrier, and he debriefed me for 5 days about the European war. And the carrier force that really wrote off Pearl Harbor was the same carrier force that came to Rabaul. And then it went on to Port Darwin, and from there to Trincomalee. But we had 24 Squadron in Darwin, in Rabaul, which was Hudson's and Wirraway behind me. And the Japanese came in and they wrote that squadron off in about 15 minutes, I think. Very brave pilots that took them on, but imagine they had over 100 fighters on their carriers, here against 2 flights of Wirraways and 1 of Hudson's. So that was the first contact, by the way, of Australians, except for Malaya.
LaRue's comment when he was told to attack the fleet the next day after losing most of his flight, he only had 2 Wirraways and a Hudson serviceable.
Correct. That's
was
correct.
Nos Muratiri te salutamus.
Yes. We who are about to die salute you. And I'll tell you what, he was right.
Even to the battle-hardened pilots returning from the European theatre, the Japanese were a brutal new enemy. At Rabaul, along with nuns and a priest, 150 soldiers were bayoneted to death by the conquering Japanese in what became known as the Toll Plantation Massacre. To stem the southward push of the invading Japanese, 75 Squadron were rushed north to Papua New Guinea in a valiant last-ditch effort to hold the island.
When they got to New Guinea, John Jackson was the commanding officer, and they serviced them very quickly, and on the same afternoon as they arrived, a Japanese reconnaissance airplane flew over, and they got up and they shot him down, and he didn't get the message to Rabaul and that we had fighters in New Guinea. He didn't get the message. So the following day, Jackson went over the mountains with his 75 Squadron Kitty Hawks, and there were the Japanese that lay all lined up, 2 rows of them, 1 each side of the runway. And they set fire to 12 of them, and they shot down a couple more. And back to New Guinea, back to Port Moresby. Now that 75 Squadron was alone against the might of the Japanese Air Force. And they lasted for 44 days, until John Jackson himself was the last man to be shot down. And he climbed up against this formation of Japanese bombers, and in the climb, of course, he was at great disadvantage, and the Japanese Zero shot him down. Well, the one airplane to come back to Australia at the 44th day was the last Kitty Hawk, flown into Horn Island. Now, that then caused great concern, because we had to rapidly rebuild 75 Squadron and 76 Squadron. And we took them off to New Guinea and down to Milne Bay, where we had built a strip. We had the 2 squadrons there, and the 2 Australian brigades, one a citizens force one, and the other one that had come back from North Africa. So we had one professional brigade and one that was not so professional, but were brave blokes, and as they turned out to be. Now, the Japs then landed at Milne Bay, but unhappily for them, they landed at the wrong place. A New Guinea, as he was then seaman, gave them the wrong place. They'd captured him and they made him their navigator. Well, they landed 6 miles to the east of where they intended, and they put their tanks ashore and so on. Now, in that 6 miles, there was a hell of a lot of jungle and rivers and so forth, and the Australians soldiers then took them on. Now, had they landed nearer the strip, they could have captured the strip and caught both of our squadrons, but they didn't. Now, that's a bit like Gallipoli, you know, they landed in the wrong place. But it was one of those divine interventions, I believe, that caused them to land in the wrong place. And that extra time that allowed our soldiers to get the feeling of them and to eventually destroy them, along with the Kitty Hawks. Now, the Kitty Hawks, they used to take off and climb up to 500 feet, and they'd look for the Japanese on the edge of the beaches and so on, and then fire at them from the air. Milne Bay was strategic. And between Milne Bay and the Kokoda Trail, we stopped the Japanese from getting to Port Moresby. They desperately wanted Port Moresby, and the reason for that was that Port Moresby controlled all shipping straight across due west from Port Moresby, that means right across under Indonesia, and right down the east coast of Australia. So no American ships could have got into the north or the east coast of Australia. They had air superiority sufficient to prevent it. So Milne Bay then was so vastly important, and so was the Kokoda.
The Japanese was so close to the strip, they thought that night they might overrun the whole operation and we would lose all our aircraft pilots and ground crew. Blue Truscott, who was the CEO of 76 Squadron, he volunteered to remain with his troops there and, if anything, fight to the death if they did overrun the strips. Fortunately, the cookie crumbled in the right direction, and the outcome was success. Next day we flew back in with the aircraft and continued the operation until such times as the Japanese force was evacuated. Every night we used to get shelled by a Japanese cruiser every night, and I think the whole effort of everybody involved down there was the secret of the success of the operation. With the amount of firing that all the Kitty Hawks did of 75 and 76 Squadron there, it took toll on the armament of the Browning guns, that the rifling on the Brownings, which kept the bullets going straight, became worn, and so much so that the barrels in turn were useless. So there was no accuracy in the flight of the bullets or anything like that at all. And from then on, it was just a matter of getting supplies. We ran out of ammunition. It was supplied by a Liberator from the USAF to keep us going. And the toil that the pilots, when they weren't flying, was belting up ammunition to use on the aircraft as quick as they could. We couldn't keep the ammunition up to the pilots or to the aircraft in that period of time. We did lose some good men there. 76 Squadron lost the CO. Squadron leader Turnbull, and where Blue Truscott became the commanding officer. And he was a wonderful man in himself, a very respected person and pilot. And he'd come back from England like lots of our replacement pilots from the UK after 75 lost the majority of their pilots in their tour at Port Moresby.
Milne Bay was the first place in the whole of the Southwest Pacific, or in the world in fact, that the Japanese were defeated on land. They withdrew and went back to Rabaul, and General Slim, as he was then, later Field Marshal Slim, in Burma said the Australians have beaten them in New Guinea. They have proven that they're not invincible. Now, you officers and soldiers in Burma, get out there now and beat them in Burma.
It was to this scenario that 30 Squadron arrived at Port Moresby, and with them the Beaufighter.
The weather was bad for starters, but of course the metal strips that they had there at Milne Bay for us to land on used to move up and down when you touched down and moved on. They'd move about at least a foot into the ground with water all over them. They weren't terribly good, apart from the conditions of the weather and the strip. There was that air of problems about us, and we didn't know what to expect really when we first landed at Milne Bay, which was the 6th of September, about 6 or 7 days after the major part of the Kitty Hawk offensive had started. Our first sortie was at Milne Bay when we were asked to strafe the Japanese destroyers and a cruiser that were up in Milne Bay Harbour, which were causing a problem to the Army during those early days of Milne Bay. But that was our very first sortie at Milne Bay on the 6th of September, whilst the rest of the crowd were coming up from Townsville.
Brian, why was the Beaufighter chosen?
It was chosen because it was a rugged aeroplane with awesome firepower. In fact, it was designed as a night fighter, and with 4 cannon and 6 machine guns, we thought that it would make an excellent ground strafer. And that's exactly what it did. Because if you hit anything with a Beaufighter, it was hit. And it was hit for good. The worst place to be is in front of an angry Beaufighter, because you're likely to get a dose of lead poisoning. And the result was that there were many aeroplanes left sitting burnt out wrecks in New Guinea as a result of the efforts of the Beaufighter. That was the reason it was chosen, and that was how it was used. In fact, I understand that the Nips didn't like it very much, and they used to call it Whispering Death, because not only was it a rugged aeroplane, but it had 2 sleeve valve engines, which made it very, very quiet.
The Japs don't like those. They call them Whispering Death. The engines are silent. They don't hear them till they're overhead.
It had fairly ginormous horsepower, and the result was that we would hit a target and go through it and belt it before the Nips even knew that we were there. Of course, we would take advantage of all the natural coverage we could get from terrain as well, but that doesn't take anything away from the Beaufighter's quiet approach.
And what about the fact that it was manufactured here as well? That's an interesting point too, isn't it?
Well, it had a great degree of commonality with the Beaufort, and the Beaufort was made in Australia eventually, and the result was that they went on and made the Beaufighter, which was a remarkable achievement when you consider that we're only a nation of 7 million people at the most at that time.
365 Beaufighters were built in Australia at a rate of 1 per day plus spares.
Conditions were pretty rugged. We had the Beaufighters scattered around the strip in revetments to give them some protection, but that didn't stop the odd one getting clobbered by Japanese raids.
Wards was a real enigma to me. When we first came into Wards, I thought it was, well, it wasn't even like a football field. It was just a strip, wasn't even tarred, it was just been made by the 5ACS, who did a great job. These airfield construction people were wonderful people. They did a great job under terrible conditions and with limited amount of machinery. But Ward's strip was very narrow, very short, and it wasn't until probably a month or two we've been operating out of Ward's that we got a strip that you felt was a bit more like a strip that you could use. Flying in New Guinea was very, very difficult those days. Not only did we only have 1 or 2 aerodromes to land on, and they were only around Port Moresby, was the fact that the maps we were using were old Admiralty charts dated in the turn of the century, and they weren't very well charted. The mountains around, the heights could be disputed. So it was very difficult to fly operationally in New Guinea at that time. There were no Met reports that you could rely on. We didn't have people who could tell us what the weather was going to be like, except to say that it'd be damned awful all the time. And on top of that, we just didn't have anywhere else to land other than the 2 or 3 strips that were around Port Moresby. The Americans were wonderful people. We certainly enjoyed some of the things that they could give us, like they were fed very well, and they'd occasionally give us some good food or what have you. But as far as their understanding of the conditions up in New Guinea, I hasten to say it, but I really believe a lot of the Americans were quite naive. They were very brave, and they certainly pushed home their attacks. But I can recall one occasion when Moss and I were flying back from an operation up the other side of Madang, and we were coming past Finschhafen, which brought us back past Lae, and of course Lae was the headquarters of the Japanese military, and was very heavily defended, and one place you kept away from. But so we were just creeping past Salamoa, and I looked out there, and there were these 2 lightnings with wheels and flaps down, and obviously headed towards Lae. And so I quickly looked up these frequencies they were operating on, and I called them up in plain language, which I shouldn't have done, of course, but I thought of these 2 aircraft and explained to them that, look, if you were looking for somewhere to land, I wouldn't land there. And they came up in their American drawl and said, well, thanks, bud, we thought this was somewhere to land, we were running out of gas. So they tucked in behind us, and we brought them back to Moresby. But the Americans were very, very casual with their navigation. Nonetheless, they were great people to fly with, and we had a lot of rapport with them, and I've made some very good friends in the Americans, but I think in hindsight, and I've spoken to them over the years, their navigation left a lot to be desired. Some of the authorities, and particularly some of the airboard, might have felt that the atmosphere around 30 Squadron was a bit laissez-faire, because the CO was quite a flamboyant character, who wore a big German Luger instead of the Smith & Wesson 38, the rest of it did. But this gave the squadron some character. We were still disciplined, very disciplined in the air. The maintenance crews did a wonderful job against all sorts of problems of the heat, the cold, the wet, the dust, the mosquitoes, the lack of air conditioning to fix up delicate instruments for the aircraft to fly with. All of this was brought together by, in my view, a complete understanding of what a squadron was supposed to do, and Brian Walker did that. I was only disappointed that later on he didn't come back and CO when I went back the second time, because I believe, in my view, as just an ordinary aircrew bloke in the squadron, that it was his figure, his impression, his experience, not only his experience, but the symbol of a great flyer. And we always felt that our CO, being a great aviator, he dragged us up along with him, and we weren't going to let him down.
With the arrival, Brian, of the Beaufighter at Wards, or Port Moresby, what changes did it bring about with your arrival at 30 Squadron?
Well, it brought about an Australian composition which was appreciated by the Army, and the Army at that stage was sending up a lot of reserve people who were not AIF and who hadn't actually been to war, and so it was a very, very great thing to have an Australian squadron operating in close conformity with the Australian Army, and that was very much appreciated by the Army.
The militia did a marvellous job, didn't they? And following that, the joining of the AIF with them, and
oh well, the militia did a wonderful job insofar as that they helped push the NIP right from their position, only about 30 miles from Moresby, right back to Guinea. They pushed them back, definitely over the Owen Stanley, and got stuck into them. And they got a lot of help from us because we were operating in fairly close support, and they would give us a briefing and we would get a line of where to strafe and where not to strafe, and that would be fairly accurate. I only ever found one person later who claimed that he'd been strafed by a Beaufighter, and I said, well, you couldn't have been. And he said, why? I said, well, because you're still alive.
what were the attacks on places like Ley like when you went over to Ley or Madang?
We didn't like that, Ley, because it was very heavily defended, and you wouldn't help but get clobbered. In fact, I lost an aeroplane over Ley myself. I can always remember feeling a loud clump and feeling the aeroplane shudder, but I felt the controls and they were still seemed to be functioning all right. And I can remember my observer saying, we've been hit. And I said, you're not whistling Dixie. And then he said, we're on fire. And I said, go and piss on it. And he said, it's gone out. And I said, thank Christmas for that. Anyhow, we got that aeroplane back to base, but we couldn't get the wheels down because they'd got one of the hydraulic lines and it had a hole through the tail end where this, obviously something about the size of 40 mil had hit it, and it didn't do it much good. Oh, I had a problem insofar as I was always told that in the Beaufighter that the gauges were pretty chronic, and that if the oil pressure gauge went suddenly off the clock, forget it. Anyhow, on this occasion, I couldn't forget it because shortly after the engine seized, and you'll always learn after the event. And I was told later on by a fellow who had a lot of experience in Beaufighters in Malta that the thing to do with the Beaufighter, if your oil pressure goes, is to open the throttle fully. And he said then, when the engine seizes, the prop comes off. And he said, you go like buggery on the other engine. But I wasn't game to do that.
Is that self-feathering, isn't there?
I wasn't game to do it. It was a rugged aeroplane, took an awful amount of punishment, and the result was that it was a good aeroplane to go to war in. In fact, when I look at it now, and I think of how little respect I showed for that aeroplane, I now feel very humble.
There would be many other memorable close shaves for 30 and 31 Squadron. However, considering the terrain and the sorties flown, damage to aircraft was relatively light. You made some friends up in New Guinea too with the Americans, Ed Larner in particular, Brian.
Oh, Ed Larner was a character, and he operated a B-25 squadron. He started off with a Boston squadron, but he finished up with a B-25 squadron, and we worked together.
When it comes to a scrap, we Aussies don't want any better coppers than you Yanks. We're tickled to death to know that you're right behind us.
Oh yeah, Blackjack? With you, boy, not behind you.
I got a letter from an American named Jack Taylor, and it was headed, "What do we do with the drunken pilot?" And I'll never forget that letter. It was really funny.
Jack, get up! We have a mission in about half an hour. My head pounded furiously. I pried one eye open. God damn it, Ed, we're stood down, I whimpered hopefully. Don't give me that shit. He shot back. Get down to the operations shack in 5 minutes for briefing. Then he was gone. We had been stood down and celebrated gloriously in Club Lakanuki until 3 or 4 in the morning. This morning. I didn't remember much between that rude awakening and starting engines in my assigned A-20. I had a very hazy recollection about the briefing. I was number 3 or 4 ships, no lights except the blue formation lights for joining up. Our bomb load was 20-pound parafrags. Taxing out, I cursed the crew chief for leaving a red light on in the cockpit. His fault, not mine. I took the runway after checking the mags and pushed both throttles open. Thank God I remembered takeoff flaps and to close the upper cowls. The bird seemed strangely sluggish, but finally broke ground. Simultaneously, I heard or felt an explosion. In a split second, it dawned on me what the red light was all about. I had left my bomb bay doors open. My God! Had I dropped a bomb on the runway? With much relief, I realized that I wouldn't be alive to think anything if that were the case. I must have blown a tire. This later proved to be the case. I closed the bomb bay doors, solving the red light problem. Sorry, crew chief, and climbed in a right turn, searching for the blue lights of number 2 in the formation so I could join up. Blue lights! Belatedly, I turned mine on. Minutes later, I thought I saw them. Perhaps I was finally starting to sober up. Yes, I had them spotted. 2 had joined on lead, and number 4 is spread wider. Was there another set of lights close to 4? Oh well, I had plenty of room to join in my assigned spot. As I slid into number 3 spot, echelon to the right, I found myself fighting with number 4 for the same spot. I held tight, and he finally gave up and took position on my right wing. We climbed in a northerly direction to clear the Owen Stanley range. Darkness had started to pale. I was beginning to see a faint outline of the other airplanes. My eyes jumped to the right fuselage of number 2. Had I joined a Japanese formation? No, wait a minute. Those birds look like Australian Beaufighters. As the concentric circles of the rAAF took form, I was reassured. I was sobering up. Peeking sheepishly to my right, I saw 2 Beaufighters on my own wing. I had indeed joined up with a bunch of Aussies, usurping the position of the Aussie leading the last element. Maybe it was my imagination, but that pilot seemed a little disgusted. We started our ascent. I saw that our target must have been the Japanese airdrome at Lae, since we were over Markham Valley, following the river toward the ocean. Then I spotted Lae dead ahead. The Beaufighters broke formation, and their attack pattern was one of the most amazing sights I had ever seen. They hit the target from all directions, looking like a bunch of bloodthirsty bandits. Their mission was strafing, and strafe they did. When they finally tired of the sport, they pulled out to sea and rejoined. Seeing that they were finished, I dove for a lower altitude and initiated my own attack, strafing and dropping my parachute fragmentation bombs alongside the side of the runway, which seemed to have some aircraft on it. As I pulled away, I heard my gunner kick in his own guns. Apparently, he wasn't too bothered by the whole mysterious string of events. Having lost sight of the Beaufighters, I returned to Port Moresby myself. I decided to land at 4 Mile Strip, as it was wider and longer than Killikilla, on my own strip, and I might have had a blown tire to consider. I made a pass, got confirmation that it was my left tire, and set up my approach. Oh, completely sober by now, I made one of the lightest touchdowns of my life. Lunner came back in a jeep and chewed my ass most of the way back to Killikilla. My gunner stayed quiet and listened to this interesting lecture. Lunner finally grinned and commented that I must have been as astute as he had been. Sometime after debriefing, we got a call from Black Jack Walker, the Aussie commander of 30 Squadron rAAF, wanting to know who the Yank was who didn't know a Beaufighter from a Boston.
Following the bombing of Darwin, 31 Squadron were rushed to the northern city.
Number 31 Squadron was the second Beaufighter squadron that was formed in 1942 in the dark days during the Japanese advance. Darwin area was still receiving Japanese attacks at the time number 31 Squadron arrived there. The worst attack I think we had while I was there was an attack just after we had the successful raid on Pemfui, when the Japanese came in and attacked at low level and managed to destroy an aeroplane on the ground and do a little bit damage with bombs. Anyhow, to go back to the formation of the squadron, we weren't sure at the beginning where we were destined to finish up, but eventually the word came through that we were destined to be based in the Darwin area. At this stage, of course, people were fearful of the Japs landing somewhere in Australia, and I think the powers that be wanted to strengthen the Darwin area a little more. Anyhow, eventually we moved to Darwin. I remember the flight up there quite vividly because it was the only time in my Beaufighter career that it let me down. I lost an engine over Catherine, and had to force land there. Anyhow, the squadron eventually was based at Kamali Creek, where I irreverently became known as Kamali Charlie. We were then planning to undertake flights into the islands around the Darwin area, into Timor, the Aru Islands, and the Tanimbar Islands, which was just about at the extreme range of the Beaufighter. The flights had to be undertaken at very low level to avoid any radar the Japanese might possess. And because they were undertaken at low level, it was important that navigation was very carefully planned. The Beaufighter also had a rather bad characteristic in that once you fired the cannons on the Beaufighter, the compasses went haywire, and the navigators had to be very cautious about using the compass after firing of the cannons. Flights were undertaken into various Jap airfields. I remember one particular flight into Pemfui on the southwest coast of Timor, which I always regarded as the most successful operation in my days in the squadron, where we were credited with destroying 18 aeroplanes on the ground. We caught the Japs asleep that day, I think, and that was all because we managed to get in at very low level without any warning. After that attack on Pemfui, I was separated somehow from the rest of the flight, and much to my horror, I found I was being attacked by a Japanese Zero that must have been airborne at the time we made the attack. And the Beaufighter could just outrun a Zero, but it was hopeless really to mix it with a Zero, because the Beaufighter, the faster you went, the heavier it got and the less manoeuvrable. It was, of course, basically designed to be a night fighter in England, and although one or two of our pilots managed to mix it with Zeros and other type of Japanese aeroplanes, it wasn't really designed for that. anyhow, on this particular flight, he made several passes at me before I managed to escape into a bank of clouds. And when we got home, there were quite a number of holes in the aeroplane.
31 Squadron had an impressive record, flying over 2,600 sorties, destroying 75 aircraft, 9 ships and important infrastructure. Operating initially from Australian soil, south of Darwin at Kamali Creek, 31 Squadron conducted long-range attacks into the surrounding Japanese-occupied islands, resulting in engagements of Japanese fighters. Several of 31 Squadron's pilots took on the Japanese, a role that the Beaufighter was not designed for. One of those pilots noted for his daring was Eric Basher Barnett.
We were making an attack on an airstrip at Fuel Aura on the plateau of Timor. I myself had just made an attack on a tent situated at the end of the runway, and I became conscious of an aircraft at about 11 o'clock high, and so I pulled around in a steep turn, climbing turn, and went straight up towards him. He came straight down at me, and we opened fire on each other, and I got hit. I got no hits actually, but I managed to, he was hitting the engine nacelle, a large part of the engine nacelle flew off, and then the next minute was a whiff of smoke, and he was just disappeared under my wing. And as I turned then to see where he was crashing, the navigator yelled out that there was another aircraft coming in on the other side, and the trace was just visible, and so I just put my nose down and then went fast as we could, because we had an advantage at zero altitude. We had about 20 miles an hour speed advantage over the zero at that particular time, and so that we outrun him, and that was it. The next day, one of our aircraft confirmed the wreck on the end of the strip, and so for Christmas Eve I received a bottle of whiskey from area headquarters, a most unusual gift at that particular time.
Barnett's sortie into Penfui is still a talking point for the squadron today.
It was a comedy of errors. It followed on a most successful one in which over 18 aircraft were destroyed, and in fact they just flew straight down the runway and used up all their ammunition just firing at the aircraft which were wingtip to wingtip. Whereas our one started badly. As soon as we hit the coast, we ran into bad weather. As we started to fly up the valley, we found that the clouds were closed in, so we had to pull up above the clouds, and in doing so we became separated. I came out of the cloud and then looked down through a gap and saw the aerodrome down below me. So I put her into a steep dive and dived onto a group of buildings. Both windows on both sides of the aircraft disappeared, and the whole cockpit filled up with all the accumulated dust and that's there, and I finished up in an inverted position and rolled out and continued right down over towards the sea on the northern side of the Timor.
That was an ammunition dump.
That was the ammunition dump that actually I'd picked on. It was no conscious effort in that respect, and as I assured an aircraft examiner who was up in questioning about the best ways of attacking the thing, was that I promised that I'd never do it again, and it's not the best of experiences.
So what happened then after you?
Well, then I circled down there, looked back. I could see Kopang Harbour. The ships there had opened up, and the anti-aircraft fire was there. And to the north, then was all the clouds were right down on the hill. So I decided to come back through the aerodrome. There were about 3 or 4 bombers and Betty bombers situated on one side of the runway. I attacked those, and then banked over to look back to see how I'd go, and the next minute I'd run into a collection of radio towers and the flagpole. The flagpole became embedded into the leading edge of the aircraft, and for a while there it looked like we had a flag with us. The navigator seemed to be more interested in that, but I pulled out of that, and then no sooner it straightened down than I became aware of a anti-aircraft position over there. So I opened fire at those things, and quite successful there. It continued on up the valley, and then as I pulled out up the valley, I could see an aircraft just above me, and I came right up underneath it, and I thought it looked peculiar for a Beaufighter, but then being in the position I was, I'd never been in that position with another bow, so I just eased to the side just as I did, then it opened fire. The trace went past, and so I slid down to the right, and then turned back in towards the aircraft. By then he was around about, going flat out, he was about 800 yards away. I tried a long shot at him, but couldn't. No hits, and chased him for about 10 minutes or so, and then he dived into a cloud, and then so then I turned around and headed back to Australia, complaining about the fact that I'd nothing in the cockpit. The cigarettes and matches had gone with the whole thing, and of course one of the first things I got back was a reprimand from area headquarters. We'd left our transmitter on, and the whole of northern Australia was aware of the fact that there was no cigarettes and matches. And but when we landed there at Drysdale Mission, there were still remnants of the flag mast. It was stuck in the leading edge with the wheel, where the cord goes through. But no flag, and quite a lot of other holes on the main planes and so on from debris and the like. There were some more amusing stories about it. Some other one had reported a door going past, and of course then the other ones had a hand attached to the door and so on. You got all these particular stories there, but as I said, it was just a series of accidents, but just being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Conditions up north, Jack, weren't particularly good for plane or personnel.
It was tough, but the aircraft maintenance was probably worse. The heat of the day to sit on an aircraft, in shorts, it burned the old bottom off, and then if you work at night, the mozzies and the moths would drive you bonkers. But the parts was terrible. If we had to get 6 aircraft ready for the next morning, we would probably go and cannibalise one of the others. We had 24 aircraft when we started, and we'd cannibalise one of those aircraft to get one going, so it was a continuous thing, a piece from here and a piece from there, to perhaps get 6 ready for the next morning. We were lucky in some ways. The Yanks were down there, and if we were near the Americans at all, they had a plane that was US, as we called it, we would always be able to scavenge off that plane. And we thank the Yanks very much for all that supply that they gave us, unbeknownst. So once again, I suppose the Allies worked together in a funny fashion.
The United States Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force were now working together. One of the most successful operations was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Bill Goering played an important role in the strategic planning of this operation, described by MacArthur as one of the most important aerial engagements of the war in the Southwest Pacific.
We got some information through breaking code that a convoy was going to be formed up in Rabaul, and they had 170 ships in Rabaul Harbour. It was going to be formed, and then to go round somewhere and land in Papua New Guinea. We didn't know quite where for the first bit, but we decided it was going to be Lae. Now, having got that information, then I went to General Whitehead, who was General Kenny's deputy and forward echelon commander in New Guinea, and I said, "Sir, we better look out how we do this. We know that they're coming. Now, it's no good unless fighting them, unless we rehearse the battle. And he said, what a brilliant idea. And they adopted it. And so they got all the American commanders of squadrons, including our number 30 squadron and 22 squadron, and the fighters at, down at Milne Bay. And the commanders of those were gathered around Cape Ward Hunt, which was halfway between Port Moresby and Milne Bay. But it was 90 nautical miles, almost exactly. And that would be where it would be worked out from Cape Ward Hunt on the north side of New Guinea to where the convoy would be if it came that way. It so happened that we were within a nautical mile. The first rehearsal down to Cape Rodney was a disaster. Some of the aeroplanes were 20 minutes late. General Whitehead and I were standing on a point at Port Moresby, overlooking the old ship on the rocks there called the Proof, and they were all supposed to be over that ship at the same time. Now, they were starting from about 10,000 feet down to water level. The object of all of that was that, knowing the Navy as I did, they had difficulty, if you concentrated on them from different heights and different directions, of finding out which was the main enemy, which, for instance, might have been, say, the A-bomb carrier. Well, we didn't have any A-bombs, so it didn't matter. But we did a second rehearsal, and that was nearly perfect. On the day before the convoy had left Rabaul and was heading to Lae, the day before it got to Lae, we intercepted that convoy. That's what we wanted. Having got that, then the Catalina, Australian Catalina, shepherded it all night long, and we attacked them with Australian Beaufighters. And the Beaufighter, under my instruction, and I'll say it, was meant to kill the commanding officer and the officers on the bridge. And did they ever? When they fired their guns and cannon, they actually blew the bridge apart or set it on fire. And certainly they killed the anti-aircraft gunners on the deck. Well, the end result was that we shot down about 50 fighters that morning. We destroyed, as I say, these 16 ships, and we lost 6 aeroplanes and 13 men killed. We lost some wounded, of course. Well, there you are. I think those odds were pretty great. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the last time that the Japanese made any attempt to get to Port Moresby. And it was General MacArthur who we'd convinced that air power meant something, said it was the greatest air battle in the Southwest Pacific.
As far as the Bismarck Sea battle was concerned, this was something different. We'd never strafed big ships like cruisers and destroyers, so it was something different. We were well briefed on how to handle it, but when we did get there, all I could see was lots of Japanese naval ships and lots of transports. There were plenty of air activity. There was, I could see Liberators upstairs about 10,000 feet, and certainly some lightnings, and there were some Zeros flitting around. But Moss and I picked up a transport and strafed it straight away. We went straight in. But one of the things that, when I look back as to how we ever survived that, was the fact that the Liberators were dropping bombs from 10,000 feet, and we were flying through the water spouts that these bombs made in the water. And coupled with that, we had the problem of the Mitchells, the B-25s of the Americans, who'd been practicing this skip bombing with 500-pound bombs, and they were very effective in practice. And but when it came to the day, to see a 500-pound bomb flying 50 feet off your starboard wing at the same speed as you were doing was a bit disconcerting. It was quite an energetic sort of an exercise. You'd hit one, whip around and do another, and then come underneath a Beaufighter going the other way. I guess it only lasted about 10 minutes, but in that time we would have strafed about 4 of these vessels, 1 destroyer and 3 transports. And I think it was an amazing thing that we lost so few. We only lost 1 Beaufighter, who I understand from talking to one of the Americans This Beaufighter, flown by Ron Downing and Danny Box, were being attacked by a Zero, and this Mitchell came in to take the Zero off his tail, and the other Zero got Browning, and another one coming in behind got this other B-25. So that was the sort of cooperation we had on the Bismarck Sea battle, which incidentally was considered to be one of the major turning points of the war against the Japanese.
In the Bismarck Sea battle, I flew number 2 on the right wing of Ed Larner, the squadron commander, and so was very much involved in the overall action. I started to make my run on about a 6,000 or 7,000 ton Japanese transport, and then I saw that another plane was coming in from the stern, so I broke off and pulled up to the right. A Beaufighter had been strafing a cruiser just as I was coming in. Of course, shells were bursting all around, and one of the shells caught me. It was a very terrific exploding filling the cabin full of smoke. So I quickly opened my bomb bays in case I had to get rid of the bombs, but this plane was still flying satisfactorily. So I made a run on about a 7,000 ton Japanese ship, hopped over it, dropped another couple of bombs on a smaller ship, and tied in with the boat riders for protection to fly back to New Guinea. And then I flew on my own on to Port Moresby. And we got to Port Moresby, we tried the airplane to see just exactly what damage was done. The main wheels would not come down. There was no flaps, no radio or anything. So I decided we'd try a crash landing at 7 Mile Strip. We tested the plane as far as its flight characteristics were concerned. It was very unstable at about 140 miles an hour, so we decided that we'd bring her in at that speed and try a crash landing, hoping we could knock off the nose wheel, which had come down and locked. The nose wheel didn't collapse on landing, but it ran down the runway with the tail going down, bouncing up, running down like a kangaroo hopping. We were doing probably about 25 or 30 miles an hour when we came to a ditch at the end of the runway. The nose wheel dropped into the niche and the plane rolled over on its side. All got out of the wreck all right, except the rear gunner who stuck a gun butt through his head. He'd failed to obey instructions getting in the clear and to pad himself. The other two, the co-pilot and the Australian gunner, were fact flying within just a very short period of time. I spent 3 months in the hospital and then was returned to flying to join the famous Colonel Pappy Gunn in experimental work at Eagle Farm.
There was, of course, still a lot of work to be done in the Bismarck Sea battle. In the day following, 22 Squadron Bostons also had to go out, and they found some of the ships. They were stationary, of course. They'd been put out of action, but they bombed those and got rid of 2 of them, as I understand. Whereas we had to do 2 things in 30 Squadron. We came back along past Ley and strafed at Malahang Strip some Zeros that had landed there, because Malahang was used as a sort of a satellite strip off Ley. But on top of that, we had that awful experience of strafing Japanese landing barges who would have been a nuisance, a very great nuisance to the military up there, the Australian forces, if we hadn't done so. I had a message to say that one of our Beaufighters who'd been somewhere in the vicinity was missing and didn't know where he was. So we searched for about 3 hours, and I remember we came back to Numfa and we'd done 6 hours and 10 minutes in a Beaufighter, and that's a fair length of time, and I don't think we had more than a few pints of petrol left in the aeroplane. But from that came this very interesting story of Mick Smith and Jack Gleason, who got lost, and eventually landed on a little island about a couple of hundred miles north of Numfa. And it's well documented, this particular event, but no one knew where they were, and although Mick had landed the aeroplane on a little strip of beach, he managed to get the starboard engine going, and they got a bit of power into the radio set, and Johnny Gleeson got a message back to Numfa to say that they were on this little island but didn't know where they were. There was another island just about 50 yards across a little spit of water, and they got onto that and they found a little house, and in that house, or a hut I guess it was a medicine bottle in the name of a Mrs. Brown. And they got that detail back to some chemist in Brisbane who was able to tell them that the island Mrs. Brown was on was Maypier Island. And from then on we got a couple of PT boats with the Americans. Eventually the aircraft was flown off, and I'd just like to make a comment about my views on the Americans. I've never seen such bravery as half a dozen Americans hopping over the side of a PT boat with rifles above their heads, wading into a shore to rescue one of their mates who I saw was shot on the beach. Moss and I came over and was strafing this beach to keep the Japanese. There was something like 200 or 300 Japs on this island who didn't like the Americans coming ashore and who wanted to disable the Beaufighter. But it was a wonderful story. Mick then, with the aid of our engineer officer and petrol that was siphoned out and transported in gallon tins to a Beaufighter, and Mick waited for low tide and flew the aeroplane off. And around about the middle of 1944, when things start to get a bit better for us and we were able to push the Japanese out of New Guinea, round about Itapi and these places, it was a great day for the Australians. But we still had a lot more to do after we defeated the Japanese at Wewak. From then on, of course, we went up to Numfa, to Labuan, or Morotai, Labuan, and did a lot of work around Tarakan and Balikpapan and over in the Celebes in Saram. The Japanese were still, although they were on the back foot and the Americans were going north, we still had a lot more to do to contain the situation and make it safe.
The Beaufighters were selected as an escort plane for the Mustangs to go to Japan as to be the occupation force aircraft. The Beaufighter having an observer in it, and the Mustangs, they were single crew. So the Beaufighters went to Labuan and met the Mustangs there and took them on the trip to Japan. We had 6 on either wing. We landed the first day at the Philippines. That part of the trip went very, very well. But after the Philippines, we left for Okinawa, and that being the closest point to Japan at that stage, where the Americans operated from. We reached Okinawa. That was okay as well. But from there we had terrific trouble in finding clear weather to make off to Japan. I think we had 3 efforts to get out, and each time we had to turn back. However, on the final day when we went out, we got past the point of no return. And so just had to keep going. The weather was so bad that looking through the window we could neither see nor hear the Mustangs on either side, though for some strange reason they seemed to be able to stay with us. We were flying at about 10,000 feet and trying to get above the storm, and decided it was just as bad up there, so found an opening and went down through it to the water's level. And we were flying just above the waves, and I really mean practically touching the waves. And the weather there was just the same. Anyhow, we were flying along, and Dave, the observer, was Dave Beasley, and the pilot was Ron Cockcroft. And Dave, we were too low to get a drift for navigation, so it was dead reckoning. And Dave thought we were on course, and as it turned out we were. But suddenly when we neared Japan, an island loomed up that wasn't evidently not on the charts at that time, and the pilot threw it straight back up in the air. and I was thrown about, and Dave was thrown about, but we took the trees on the top, and there was trees and leaves and things flying everywhere. So the old bird was really tough, and when we landed in Japan, the boys looked in the nacelles and it was full of timber, and it's a wonder that particularly the back cylinders were able to operate because it'd been an air-cooled motor. And the boys said, no doubt about the old Beaufighter, she's one of the toughest aircraft we've ever seen. And looking in, they said, you've got enough timber in there, Jack, for firewood for another month. The unfortunate part about the trip is that 3 Mustangs, they did not make that particular island and ploughed into the island. And there was a mosquito about half an hour behind us, and it disappeared also. Whether it went in there or not, nobody knows. So it was rather a tragic trip. The poor old pilots in the Mustangs not having navigation aids and relying on, I don't know how they could see us, relying on just dead reckoning also. But it was tragic to lose 3 of the Mustangs. But the Beaufighter, it came through 100%. Slight dents in the cowling, but nothing much to show. And it was certainly a tough old heavy aircraft.